probably about 90 to 100 minutes.
Okay, all good. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our latest installment of the Crusades live stream history series, or recorded if you're watching it in the future. We'll skip over this stuff. My name is Robert. I'll be more of like your co-host, along with my friend Zach, who will also be helping us with all the technical administrative things in the background. But the real star of the show today is our friend Richard Sassoon, who is going to be leading us through the Crusades. This is a this is the third part of a series that Richard is doing on the Crusades. You can find all of the series, either the previous ones or the future ones, on our YouTube channel, which is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. I'll post the links for those in the Zoom chat if you're watching us live. And with that, let me turn it over to Richard. Richard, take it away. It's all yours. And Richard, thanks so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your knowledge on this fascinating topic, the Crusades.
No, thank you so much for having me, Robert. It's really been a pleasure. All right. So let me share my screen.
And as Richard mentioned, if you're watching live, prefer to use the chat as opposed. I know sometimes in our Zoom programs, we tell people to use the Q&A. Sometimes we use the chat. This one, it'd be better if you use the chat and not the Q&A.
So today, because of the hard stops in the past, we're a little bit behind schedule. That's not a problem. I'm more than happy to take as much time as it needs. If it requires a fifth session, Robert and I will talk about that, and that could become a possibility. So don't worry about asking questions and comments. I just want to point out that it's a little bit different than what we indicated on the schedule. We're going to do the third, fourth, and to the extent that we can cover it, the fifth and sixth Crusades today. So the rules. I'm not an academic. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, sociology, or pretty much any of the disciplines that we're going to be talking about today. I'm a lawyer by training, and so this is just my knowledge as a layperson. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do. And that said, despite the fact that this is going to be about religious topics, certainly, I'm going to try and give my presentation from a secular point of view. My third rule is that we should always be respectful, right? Will Wheaton's law. And let's try and treat these subjects with sensitivity. That said, I love interactivity. Please ask your questions, comments, clarifications, put them in the chat. I do read the chat. I do comment in real time. I may want to say a couple more things before I respond to your particular query, but I will get there and I will get to it. All of my sessions are what I call a 101 and a 201. And a 101 is if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And a 201 is that if you know something already, I'll probably still tell you something you didn't know, get a little bit deeper into specifics that you're unaware of. I also have a rule that it's a 90-minute hard stop. So right now we're at 2:11. So we'll go until about 3:41 or 3:42 in the afternoon. And once we get to that 90 minutes, there's going to be no new slides, no new information. I will still respond to questions. We can continue having a chat, but you don't have to worry about leaving at that point because you won't be missing what we'll cover in the next session, right? It'll just go over. And this is a recording, as Robert said. You are more than free to watch it later and come back and see how these things are progressing, because it is a complicated story that's taking all this time, and so seeing all the pieces together is really helpful. All right, so when we left our discussion last time, we had established that there were 4 distinct Crusader states, right? We had the County of Edessa, which was founded by Baldwin of Bologna through his relationship with the Armenians. You had Antioch, which was founded by Bohemond of Toronto through his makeshift alliance with the Armenian Mamluk Firuz. You have the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was sort of the central Crusader state and the Crusader state to which all the other Crusader states had loyalty and vassalage. And the 4th Crusader state, the County of Tripoli. And the County of Edessa, we remember, was defeated by the Zengids in 1144, so it sort of disappears off the map. And the Fatimid Caliphate that you can see in the lower left-hand side of the map, the southwest, that gets replaced by Saladin, and we'll sort of go over that a little bit again. In the north, you can also see the Armenian Principality of the Principality of Armenian Cilicia, and that was an Armenian state formed by Armenians in exile. We discussed that a little bit last time we met. And the Armenians tended to be strongly aligned with the Crusaders and slightly antagonistic towards the Byzantines, on decent relations with the Turks, actually. And therefore, they were able to facilitate a lot of the economic and political development in the Crusader states. Then we mentioned, of course, in 1144 that the Principality of Armenia and Cilicia was defeated by the Byzantine Empire, but a few decades later, Toros of Edessa was able to, Taurus the Great was able to return to Armenian Cilicia and make it independent again, and it resumed this sort of positive relationship with the Crusader states. So one of the things that demonstrates the power of the Crusader states in the 1100s is this War of Egyptian Succession, as I'm calling it. Historians generally tend to call it the Crusader invasion of Egypt, which I think is deeply unfair, considering that the Crusaders were not the only ones invading. You also have the Zengids invading, right? So you can see on the map, as we discussed last time, those red lines are invasions by the Crusader states, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Those green lines are invasions by the Zengids, led by Nur ad-Din and his chief general Shirkuh. Shirkuh being one of the first major Kurds recorded in history. We have Kurds who have appeared in historical records before, but he's one of the first ones that we have an actual name for. And of course, Shirkuh's nephew was Saladin. And because of the outcome of the Egyptian War of Succession, which we went into a bit of detail about last time we met, Saladin becomes the chief vizier, the grand vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, and then abolishes the Fatimid Caliphate and proclaims himself sultan. Somebody's asking about the castle on the first slide. That is Clat de Chevalier. That was a Crusader castle. We discussed it in the first session, and it was one of a number of Crusader castles built in the 1100s to defend the Crusader states from the Muslim emirates further inland. So then Saladin, as we mentioned last time, fought a number of wars, consolidating the territories of the Zengids under his authority. Now, while Nur ad-Din, his nominal lord, was in power, Saladin had continued to pay tribute and to appear loyal. But the moment that Nur ad-Din died, he did not bestow the same favor upon Nur ad-Din's successors, especially As-Salih, who was his only son. And so there were these battles, as we talked about last time, where he fought the Battle of the Horns of Hama in 1174, defeating the lead general of As-Salih, which was Muzaffar ad-Din Gakbari. And Muzaffar ad-Din Gakbari, as you can tell by the name, was a Turk. But the ethnicities between different Muslims were not very important in this time period. In fact, the different ethnicities in the Islamic world would only really become a major sticking point in the last 400 years of history. Prior to this point, it was more, were you in the Muslim community, were you not in the Muslim community? That said, Gukburi had been a general in one of the armies that opposed Saladin, but Saladin saw that this man was incredibly capable, and so he asked if Gukburi would swear loyalty to him and fight in his army after defeating him at the Battle of the Horns of Hama. And Gukburi agreed, and Gukburi actually became one of Saladin's chief generals. And for his continued loyalty to Saladin, Saladin gave him the governorship of Mosul, which is that city in northern Iraq, at the furthest edge of Saladin's empire from Egypt, which shows the degree of trust that he had in Gukburi, because that was so far out of his area of normal and nominal control. We also mentioned that that Saladin married Ismat ad-Din Khatun, Ismat ad-Din, right, the daughter of three dynasties, the woman of three dynasties, because she was the child of Mu'in Ener, who was the last Burid governor of Damascus. Remember, Damascus was an independent city-state, so she was the inheritor of that city-state, and she gave it in marriage to Nur ad-Din Zengi, right, that Zengid feudal lord to which Saladin owed allegiance. And when Nur ad-Din died, in order to demonstrate that he was now in control of Damascus, Saladin himself married Ismat ad-Din, She was reputedly a very wise woman, and a very skilled diplomat. If you look at the map very closely, you can see along the border between the here it's called Outre Jourdain, the part of of Palestine on the other side of the Jordan River. But if you but this is the Kingdom of Jerusalem during the time of Saladin's conquest, more or less. And you can see right here on the border between the Bourids and the Kingdom of Jerusalem is the city of Banyas. The Crusaders had fought a battle to besiege the city of Banyas. It was in a very strategic location. For those who are more familiar with this geography in the modern day, Banyas is almost on the border between the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights and the Syrian-controlled Golan Heights. So you can see from a strategic point of view, this area is very desirable because it is a mountainous area, which would give you a high vantage point over your enemies. And the Bourids at that time would have been unable to defend the city effectively, but she was able to make a peace deal with the Crusaders that made them break off the siege, and therefore she saved the borders of her city-state. So because of this ability, this skilled ability of diplomacy, Ismat ad-Din Khatun was really revered by the Damascene Arabs under her tutelage. I have a question of whether Outre Jourdain is the same as Outremer. Technically, the terms are slightly different. They're used interchangeably. Outremer means on the other side of the sea. So that refers to all of the Crusader territories in the Levant region, right? Those 4 Crusader states that we outlined, possibly with or without the county of Edessa, because the county of Edessa has no coastline. Then Outre Jourdain means on the other side of the Jordan River. So technically it refers to those portions that are east of the Jordan River. So most of the territory that the Crusaders controlled was on Cisjordanie, on the part of Jordan on the near side, right? So that's the difference in nomenclature, but many people will use those terms interchangeably. Okay. And then we talked about the Siege of Masyaf. And the Siege of Masyaf was part of Saladin's attempt to reunify all of the Muslim principalities and states in the Levant region in order to have a consolidated approach towards the Crusader states. And Masyaf was controlled at that time by the Assassins, which is a Shiite order, right? In the same way that the Templars, the Teutonics, the Hospitaliers are orders of knights under the Christian banner, the Assassins were an order under the Nizari Ismaili banner, right? So it's just the same type of organization, just under a different religious leadership. Now, the Nizari Ismailis were a break-off sect of Shiism that had broken off from the Fatimid Caliphate and therefore actually survived past Saladin's destruction of the Fatimid Caliphate. So what ends up happening here is that Saladin besieges the fortress at Masyaf, and the leader of the assassins, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, orders assassins to put a note above Saladin's head that would warn him that if he continued the siege, the assassins would come after him. And Saladin awoke. He heard the sound of them coming into his room, but was unable to stop them. He saw the note. The dagger itself was also poisoned. Thankfully, he didn't touch it. He did decide to call off the siege and make a peace treaty with the assassins. Now, for those of you who may have played the first Assassin's Creed video game, the Assassin's Creed video game takes place roughly in this time period, and the climax of the game is actually the attempt to kill Saladin, right? Because in the video game, putting a small notice is not going to be that much fun. Is trying to kill Saladin and then coming to an agreement with him regarding the assassins. So they tried to play it somewhat historically in that video game. It gets more and more ahistorical as the series progresses. But though it's important from a historical point of view, is that the assassins are guaranteed protection and stay neutral in the conflict between Saladin and the Crusader states. And this is important because in several of the previous encounters that Muslim forces have had in trying to take down the Crusader states, the assassins have fought on the side of the Crusader states. They would do anything necessary to protect their individuality and autonomy. So if one side appeared to be becoming more and more empowered, they would probably take that side down through targeted assassinations. And those targeted assassinations went after key leaders in the Islamic world almost as much, if not more, than key leaders in the Christian world, but they did target both. So Saladin, right after the Battle of Masyaf, goes through a near-death experience. I believe it was a heart attack, but don't quote me on that. But after this near-death experience, he realizes that he does not have a significant amount of time left, and he wants to fulfill his vision, his primary goal of jihad, of holy war. And of course, jihad means a lot of things in addition to holy war, but holy war is part of that definition. And his understanding of this was to remove all of the Crusader governments from the Levant region. And so he assembled a military composed primarily of his Egyptians, especially the Mamluk cavalry, right? The Mamluk themselves are Turks, but they're Turks who have been bought and sold to Egyptian masters and put as light cavalry. You then have Nubian landsmen. We talked about this a little bit. These are foot soldiers. He also begins to incorporate Arabs from the Levant region that he's conquered. So he's also got Arab foot soldiers in this mix. And together he brings together a force of 30,000, which in the scheme of modern warfare seems very small, but you have to remember that the size of militaries at this point, especially in a region as lowly populated as the Levant was, this was a massive military by local standards. You can compare that to the fact that there were roughly 1,200 knights, 1,400 knights, somewhere around those numbers, in the entirety of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, right? So that should give you an idea about the size of this military. And so Saladin moves this military against the city of Tiberias, where a number of Crusader leaders had been living. And so seeing this large military, the Crusader nobles were arguing amongst themselves about, oh, wait, sorry. I thought I had a slide in here that I missed, but it's okay. The Crusader nobles debated among themselves what they would do to confront this new invasion of Saladin at Hattin. So in order to understand how this debate is going to go, I'm going to need to go back a little bit. You have Queen Sibylla, and she is the last, you have Queen Sibylla, and she was a queen by accident. What had originally happened was she was the younger sister of Baldwin IV, and Baldwin IV was considered to be the rightful heir of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But when Sibylla was 10 and Baldwin was a little bit older, he was diagnosed with leprosy. And so it meant that he probably wouldn't be ruling for a long period of time. So quickly, she was taken out of the nunnery where she had been, and where she was being taught to be ladylike and proper, but not anything close to being an actual leader of a country, and hastily put in charge of doing that. And it was really not where she wanted to be. Additionally, because of the misogynistic view at the time that women couldn't be rulers, or couldn't be effective rulers, and also Sibylla was not helping this fact by not being a competent person herself, they started to try and find suitors for her, starting at the age of 14. The first two men that came did not find her suitably interesting or attractive enough, and so she was very forlorn. The first guy who accepted to marry her did marry her and gave her a son. which was, of course, what the Crusaders needed in order to have a continuing lineage. The problem, of course, was that he died about 3 days. About 3 days after she gave birth to this son, which created a whole host of problems. If he's dead, he can't be an effective prince consort, and because Queen Sibylla has already borne a son, any suitor that would marry her would no longer have access to that future rulership of the kingdom of Jerusalem because of the laws of primogeniture, right? Only the firstborn son can inherit a royal throne. The second and thirdborn sons have to make money some other way. And so she was, for want of a better term, on the modern dating market, undesirable, despite the kind and caring woman that she ostensibly was. And one guy literally swept her off her feet, and that's Guy of Lusignan. So Guy of Lusignan decides he doesn't care that she's a single mother. He's going to marry her. He loves her. This, then the other thing. And for a while Baldwin IV was alive, it was okay. But the nobles hated Guy of Lusignan. They considered him almost as incompetent as she was, and somebody who should not be the king of Jerusalem. So when Baldwin IV died, the nobles came up to Sibylla and said, we know that you are the queen by blood, but we honestly can't stand your husband. So here's the situation. If you want to become the queen and rule in your own right, you have to get divorced. And that's it. And Queen Sibylla thought about it for a second, and she said, okay, but I want a caveat. I want the caveat that that when I become queen, I can marry whoever I want. And the nobles said, okay. And for those of you who are thinking about 5 seconds ahead of me, you've already spotted the loophole. And so she remarries Guy of Lusignan as soon as she becomes queen. And the nobles are furious, but that was the deal. So now we get back to this argument about Saladin's forces, right? So Guy of Lusignan is there, and the nobles are with him trying to decide whether or not they're going to confront this massive force arranging itself in the eastern part of the country. And basically, Guy of Lusignan doesn't know whether he should engage or not engage. And most of the nobles were opposed to engagement. Some of the nobles were in favor of it, especially Renard Chatillon. Renard Chatillon was very much in favor of engaging with Saladin, primarily because he was just a very violent person. He conducted many raids into Saladin's territory before, and he was one of those guys. You can I think if you sort of personalize it, he's the kind of guy at a bar who's looking for a fight. That's the kind of personality that he was. And the nobles didn't like him either very much. But the thing is that there weren't that many nobles around. So all of these nobles had to be consulted, because otherwise they wouldn't bring enough forces to the battle. And eventually Guy of Lusignan listens to Renard Chatillon, and the two of them decide to march on Tiberias and confront Saladin's military. Now, as I said, most of the knights went with this army, but the army itself wasn't just these knights. The army also consisted of peasants from the local area. These people would have not been terribly skilled in combat, passable, but not terribly skilled. And the largest contingent, probably speaking, were the Turkopols. And you can see sort of an image of a Turkopol in the lower right-hand side. Now, a Turkopol is really no different from a Mamluk. You can see it's a light cavalry unit, and there's a reason for that. These are Turks, no different than the Mamluks. The only difference is that these are free Turks, and they have either always been Christian, or they converted to Christianity to serve in the Crusader states. This meant that by Islamic law, most of them were apostates. And as was the Islamic law enforced at the time, both by Saladin and by others, apostasy carries with it a death sentence. So while we talked about in the previous discussion that Saladin was very magnanimous with those who surrendered to him. Those Turkopols who surrendered to Saladin knew that they would be executed, which meant that they were some of the most ferocious fighters on the battlefield on behalf of the Crusader states, because they knew anything short of victory meant death. So now you have this military, and they get to what are called the Horns of Hattin. The Horns are an area of raised hills halfway between where the army started marching on the coast of the Mediterranean and Tiberias, which is close to the Sea of Galilee. When the Crusader forces, including the Turkopols, got here, they were fatigued from the long march, and it was a march uphill. They were also incredibly thirsty, and they knew that if they got to Tiberias, they could drink from the lake, but here in the Horns of Hattin, there were very few springs. In fact, the one spring, you can see it on the map, is on the far side of the city of Hattin. You can see it right here. And Saladin had been tracking them. He had a number of scouts in the region. And so when he saw this Crusader force moving eastward, he completely surrounded it. And you can see in the brown all of Saladin's forces arrayed against the Crusader army, and he crushed it. We are talking significant amounts of casualties on the Christian side. Saladin had some casualties, but more or less got off well. Guy of Lusignan was surrendering. You can see this very famous picture in the upper right hand side, where Guy of Lusignan is putting down arms in front of Saladin. Guy of Lusignan was imprisoned, but he was not killed. Neither were most of the Christian troops. As I said, the Turkopols, to the extent that they were captured, were all killed, and Reynald of Châtillon was killed immediately because, in addition to raiding Saladin's territory, he had attacked Muslim pilgrims going on the Hajj, or the ritual pilgrimage to Mecca, which was an exceptional crime in the eyes of most Muslims. To be fair, the Crusaders weren't terribly saddened that Reynald was killed, but they were bothered that their king was now in prison. That said, Saladin ransomed Guy of Lusignan and let him go free because, I believe correctly, Saladin presumed that an incompetent king was better than letting the nobles figure out for themselves how they were going to win. After defeating the majority of the Crusader army at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, the ability for the Crusaders to defend the majority of their castles along the Mediterranean was severely hampered, and Saladin went after all of the fortresses one by one: Beirut, Sidon, Tebnin, Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, right down the coast. And with the exception of Tyre, which we're going to get into for a second, all of these fortresses fell, which meant that by the middle of 1187, the only two parts of the Crusader state of Jerusalem that were still in Crusader hands were the city of Tyre on the coast, in what's now southern Lebanon, and the city of Jerusalem, which is now between the states of Israel and Palestine. So we have this situation where now the Crusader states of Tripoli and Antioch had signed a truce with Saladin. They had not been part of the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, and so Saladin was willing to let them be at peace for the moment while he concentrated his forces on the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So as we get towards the end of 1187, Saladin approaches the city and demands its surrender, saying that if he is forced to besiege the city, he will do what the Crusaders did the first time around, right? That mass slaughter of all of the local inhabitants. And the Christians, by contrast, really don't have much of a leg to stand on in terms of their ability to counter demand. But they basically say that they're going to give him the fight of his life if he tries to take the city. However, they are willing to make terms. And the Christians are led by Jean d'Ibelin, or John of Ibelin. If you watch the Last Crusader movie, the protagonist in the show is played by Orlando Bloom, is Jean de Bellin. So while he wasn't born in France, he was born in Jerusalem. Most of the way he is portrayed in that movie is relatively accurate in terms of the person he was and how he tried to hold Jerusalem against Saladin. The siege lasted for a few months, but the Crusaders were willing to talk terms, and this time Saladin was much more generous. And Saladin has a reputation for being generous, and so his first offer was actually quite surprising to most of the Crusaders who were in Jerusalem. And Saladin's offers were these. If you could pay as a Christian, you could ransom yourself free, and you would be free to leave, and you could go to any place outside of his control, which meant for the most part that they would go to Tyre. If you could not pay the ransom tax, you would be enslaved. But he was very generous in terms of the conditions for manumission, meaning that if you were elderly and you couldn't pay, he would free you. If there were some extenuating circumstances, he would also free you. But for the most part, if you couldn't pay, you would be enslaved, but that was a very small portion of the Christian population. And Saladin, basically let these Christians go and leave freely. They would not be harassed, and he saw to it that his forces, as much as they may wish to loot the Christians on the way, were not allowed to do so, which got him a lot of respect from the Crusaders as he left. The one thing that the Crusaders had planned to do, if really forced to do it, was to blow up all the holy sites. But of course, because of these terms, Saladin was able to take the city, and he considered this to be his crowning moment of glory. We talked last time about the Fatimids taking Jerusalem, and when the Fatimids tried to conquer Jerusalem, they were not conquering it for its holy value. When Saladin was conquering it, that absolutely was on his mind. And Saladin valued the site of Masjid al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock sanctuary. And he performed several services there once he had taken the city. This to him was his moment of glory. He had finally unified most of the Levant region, and he had brought Jerusalem back under Islamic rule after 88 years of Christian control. So we really get to Saladin being on the cusp of victory. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, which is a little clearer than the map on the left-hand side, you can see that the Crusader state of Jerusalem is really just the city-state of Tyre, that Tripoli and Antioch are also barely more than city-states, significantly reduced in their area. And Guy of Lusignan, after he had been ransomed, had made his way back to Jerusalem, and he was among the people who wanted to go back to Tyre because Saladin had let everybody go. But Tyre was under the control of a new leader named Conrad of Montferrat, and Conrad absolutely refused to let Guy into the city or any of his supporters into the city because he did not want to hand over authority that he had basically won through fighting repeatedly against Saladin's sieges to a person that he believed was thoroughly incapable of running the city. So Guy of Lusignan actually ended up trying to move south towards Acre to try and take it by his own power, which was basically the only move he had left. And we're going to talk a little bit about the siege of Acre that he begins in a few slides, because it's a rather complicated set of maneuvers. But Saladin keeps trying to take the city of Tyre, and Tyre keeps refusing. One of the most famous battles is the battle fought by Sancho Martin. So you would have these sorties where the knights would leave the castle and attack the Muslim troops that have been circling around them. Again, these Nubian landsmen, these Arab swordsmen, and these Mamluk on horseback. And one of the most famous of these warriors was Sancho Martin, also called Sancho the Green, because as you can see in the picture, his armor was of a green color. Sancho fought so well that similarly to Muzaffareddin Ghiberti, Saladin approached him and asked if Sancho would fight in his army. Sancho refused the offer, primarily because Saladin would require him to convert to Islam, in order to serve in his military, and because Sancho was loyal to the Crusader cause. I have a question of why the Dome of the Rock was valued by Muslims. The Dome of the Rock was valued by Muslims because the rock under it, the one that the Jews call the Temple Mount, is called by Muslims as the foundation stone. They believe that the world was created from that point. So it's holy for that reason. The secondary reason is the events of the Miraj, which is that according to, I don't know what you want to say, legend or Quranic understanding, because it's not explicitly mentioned in the Quran how these events transpired, but these events are referred to in the Quran and are expounded by Islamic religious teaching, that in the middle of the night, there was a winged creature called a Burak, very similar to a Pegasus, that carried Muhammad from Mecca, where he was at the time, to Jerusalem. And when he stood upon the foundation stone, he was ascended to heaven. At that point, he meets with all the other prophets, Adam, Noah, Moses, and Jesus. And after having very fruitful discussions with them, is descended back to the foundation stone, and the Burak reflies him back to Mecca. So because of these two events, the creation of the world and the Miraj, the Temple Mount has that kind of significance in Islam. And the mosque, or Masjid al-Aqsa, means the farthest mosque, because the way the Quran describes it is that the location that the Burak took him to was the location of the farthest mosque. So they named that, so they created that mosque and they named it that, in recognition of the fact that, according to this story, the place of ascension was here in Jerusalem. I have a question of why did Saladin let many knights go to Tyre when he wanted to capture it? It's not that many knights went to Tyre. There weren't that many knights left in the territory anyway. But the reason that Saladin let them go is because he honored his terms of surrender. As a military commander, it was his view that if you treat your enemies well, that they'll respect you and that they'll treat you better. And by and large, that worked for him. He was able to reunify a number of different Muslim principalities that had been resistant to him, and he did that by practicing clemency towards his enemies. All right. So now with the Crusaders stuck at Tyre, they're really hoping for another crusade. And the fall of Jerusalem resounds through the West, and really convinces the leaders of Europe that they need to launch a crusade. Now, Britain and France had been resistant, England and France had been resistant to performing a crusade for a long period of time. And the reason they had been resistant is that the two of them were engaged in a lot of wars. Remember, at this point in time, England controls territory on the mainland of Europe, and France doesn't control the entire hexagon, right? That territory that France controls today on the continent. And so the kings of England actually spent more time in what is today France than they did in what is today England. One perfect example of this is Richard I, who, despite being the quote king of England, didn't speak a word of English. And he and King Philip II of France had been in numerous wars, but they agreed with the fall of Jerusalem and a papally enforced truce between them that they would go together on the crusade, and therefore there wouldn't be as much fear that one might make a move while the other one was away. The third party involved was Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who really saw that the Crusaders were in trouble, and a number of German Crusaders had gone beforehand. There were a number of familial ties that he had to both the Byzantine Empire and to some of the Crusader states, and so for him it was a natural situation for him to want to contribute. And so you had these three kings. Richard and Philip decide to go by water, while Frederick decides to go overland in terms of getting to the Middle East and assisting with the situation. And while they decide to leave in 1189, they don't actually get there until 1191 for the most part. So I have a question of whether Richard the First was son of Catherine of Aragon and Henry. I think he was. No, sorry. You mean Henry VIII? No. Henry VIII lived 3 centuries later. I actually don't know if he's the son of Henry III. If somebody could look that up and put that in the chat, I'll clarify that. Somebody explained that it's Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine were his parents. Thank you. All right. So Frederick Barbarossa is, as I said, is deciding to come overland. He arrives in the Byzantine Empire, which has been dealing with the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks have become increasingly emboldened as time has gone on. And so his reception in the Byzantine Empire is not particularly great. But still, he moves past that and enters Seljuk territory, getting to the city of Ikonium, or as the Turks call it still to this day, of Konya. Now, in terms of the battle, as you can see on the map on the right-hand side, breaking into the citadel was actually not that difficult for Frederick Barbarossa's forces. You can see them outlined in purple on the map. But what Kilij Arslan II was trying to do was making Frederick Barbarossa split his forces in pursuit of the light cavalry. As we discussed before, one of the Seljuks' favorite tactics is the feint attack, the F-E-I-N-T, feint attack, which is to move the horses in a false retreat, separate the lines of the enemy that are stretched out from fighting over all this distance, and then come around and mop up the forces. Frederick, however, for reasons that are unclear from the historical sources, was able to avoid this tactic, concentrate on the flanks individually, and force Kilij Arslan II to cede him the city. Eventually, the citadel, which is in the southeastern side of the city, was taken, and the city of Iconium was plundered, which gave significant resources for the German forces, the German-led forces, to continue. I have a question about each tile in the illustration. Each tile in the illustration represents a unit of troopers. So the ones that are horses are probably about 10 knights or 12 knights. The ones that are lancemen are probably significantly more, maybe 30, 40 lancemen. Not all of them are knights. Remember, they're bringing a lot of different forces. Now, I have a question. Did the Crusader Knights wear the Knights Templar tunics with the big red crosses, or is this more of a Hollywood construct? There were certainly the Templars who wore that. The general knights wore whatever armor they had. Usually it wasn't emblazoned with anything. I think if you look at the painting, and you see the German in the leftmost part of the painting, that's probably the closest idea that you can have to what the majority of the Christian knights were wearing. So it was just metal armor, and it wouldn't be emblazoned with anything because that costs a lot of extra money. In terms of the cloth that Templars would wear over their armor, that was part of their order. Now, after defeating the city of, and the armor was self-supplied, they had to buy the metal and have it shaped for themselves. There was no mass production. So after looting the city of Iconium, or the city of Konya, Barbarossa continues, and he gets to the Guksu River. Now, Frederick Barbarossa, despite growing up in Germany, never learned how to swim. And so when he got to the Guksu River and he didn't realize that it had overflowed his banks, he ended up tripping and drowning in the river. Because since he was the primary force holding this German army together, and remember, when we say Germany at this point, or Holy Roman Empire, we're not talking about one unitary state the way that we're talking about Germany today. We're talking about a confederation of different countries. Think of it similarly to the European Union of today. And you have this confederation of different countries, and as soon as Frederick Barbarossa dies, about half of the troops decide that the crusade is not for them, and they go back to Europe. A small contingent continues its way down to Jerusalem, but these are led by dukes or by lower level nobles that commanded significantly less respect, and the majority of this force never ends up making it to the Levant, despite never having actually lost a battle. You also have to remember that Frederick Barbarossa was in his 70s at the time, so the fact that he couldn't swim against a very powerful river also is more believable in that context. All right, so now we mentioned that Guy of Lusignan was in this very weird situation with Conrad de Montferrat, where he could not enter Tyre. And so his supporters and him decided that what they would do is besiege the city of Acre. Now, in order to understand this, I need to sort of explain the map a little bit. If you see on the westernmost side, you have the city, and the city has a Muslim garrison, an Arab Muslim garrison put in place by Saladin. To the east of that, you have the besiegers led by Guy of Lusignan trying to take the castle. But because the siege lasts so long, you then have Saladin coming to reinforce the garrison on the easternmost side and building a camp. That camp begins to attack Guy of Lusignan. So in order to protect himself from Saladin, they build their own trench. And so you have what's effectively a double siege. You have the siege of Acre by the Crusaders and the siege of the Crusaders by Saladin. And this siege goes on for nearly 2 years, including 2 extremely bitter winters that were devastating on both the garrison in Acre, the Muslim garrison in Acre, and on the Crusaders in the hills outside of the city. In order to resupply Acre, you had a large Egyptian fleet that was deployed by Saladin to continue to send goods to the city. And to prevent this, the Crusaders engaged with the Genoese, who were in Tyre. There was a Genoese quarter in Tyre, and worked with the Genoese so the Genoese navy would fight the Egyptians off the coast and prevent the relief of the siege. But at the same time, the Genoese would be responsible for bringing food to Guy of Lusignan's siege, right? Because they needed food as well, and they needed resupply. So you had these massive skirmishes between the Genoese navy and the Egyptian navy over the supply of these 2 sieges that were coterminous. And the Crusaders were building their own siege equipment in this limited stretch of land, felling trees to create catapults and trebuchets in order to take the position. Saladin did have communication with the garrison. The garrisons were able to sometimes send people around the edge of the Crusader defenses and get messages. And Saladin tried to make agreements with the besieging Crusaders. Even the garrison once or twice was willing to surrender if all of their men could be spared, and the Crusaders wouldn't have it. Eventually, though, Richard's army arrives by sea. Philip's army had arrived a little bit beforehand, but Philip wasn't able to conduct the diplomacy with as much aplomb as Richard was able to. So Philip was there for 4 months fighting, not making much headway. Richard was able to reach out to Saladin and begin negotiating terms for the resolution of the conflict, especially since at that point the garrison just gave up and surrendered. They were too emaciated to continue. After his 4 months, Philip and the victory in Acre, Philip II decided that he had done his duty as a crusading king. He'd had his long-standing vacation, and he decided he wanted to go back to France. So that's exactly what happened. And so, of the three kings that led the Third Crusade, Frederick was already dead, Philip II was gone, and Richard I became the king running the European contingent of the Third Crusade. Now, Richard and Saladin were beginning to negotiate over how the peace treaty should be concluded. One of the terms of the treaty was that Saladin would be required to pay an indemnity to the Crusaders, and that Saladin would be required to return the true cross. One of the things that Saladin had taken when he defeated Guy of Lusignan and Renaud de Chatillon at the Horns of Hattin in 1187 was a part of the true cross, meaning the cross upon which Jesus Christ was sacrificed. And Saladin kept adding additional terms, he kept stalling the negotiations, and Richard wasn't sure what the tactic was, but he suspected that Saladin was waiting for reinforcements to re-engage the Crusaders in battle. In order to show that he was serious and that Saladin needed to actually make peace and hold it with him, he marched 3,000 Muslim prisoners out of the city. Now, as I said, the majority of the Muslims were vacated when the Crusaders entered, but there were these 3,000 prisoners that were not part of the forces that were allowed to leave. And Richard told Saladin to stop trying to change the terms of the negotiation. And he killed, within sight of the Muslim camp, all 3,000 of these prisoners of war as a show that he was very serious about enforcing these terms. This is called the Massacre of Ayadiya. Within the Muslim camp, this was seen as a total outrage. All the Christian prisoners of war that they had were similarly gutted as a response. Saladin stopped paying the indemnity. Weekly installments. He stopped paying the indemnity. But despite that, this was an incredibly negative act. Saladin and Richard continued negotiating in future encounters. This encounter, however, Saladin withdrew his forces. Christians at the time from Acre, from Guy of Lusignan's camp, were quite angry with the way that Richard had behaved. They didn't consider it becoming of a Christian king to kill prisoners of war, even if those prisoners of war were Mohammedans. And so it lowered their esteem of him a little bit, but not extremely. Now, Richard himself found himself in a very strange situation because Conrad de Montferrat and Guy of Lusignan both claimed to be the king of Jerusalem. And Richard was able to broker an agreement between them because Conrad did not want Guy to be in power, but Conrad was a younger man. And so the agreement was that as soon as Guy of Lusignan died, Conrad would inherit the throne from him. And this seemed to placate both men and put them relatively at ease in terms of continuing to work with Richard in reclaiming the territory of the former Kingdom of Jerusalem. The former territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. All right. So now Richard starts moving down the coast. And as he's moving down the coast, Saladin begins to send his sipahi, his light cavalry, along with his Mamluks, to launch arrows into the convoy. Now, if you're looking at this map, that shows the way Richard was marching south, which on this map is towards the right-hand side. The coast is to the west, which is at the bottom of the map, and the interior where Saladin is coming from is on the eastern side of the map, or the top, right? So the map is rotated about 90 degrees. Now, the thing is that these arrows were not terribly lethal to the Crusaders. Most of them had chainmail armor, and so the majority of these arrows either glanced off or were absorbed by the armor and didn't really hurt the Crusaders in any meaningful way. That said, they were painfully annoying. I have a comment that somebody's not seeing the map. If just confirm that you're seeing the page Battle of Arsuf. Because if you're seeing the Battle of Arsuf, the picture on the left-hand side is the map. Because Arsuf is not a city, it's a region. So as they move through this area, the Knights Hospitalier, Richard orders his soldiers, because generally speaking, these attacks are resulting in minimal damage, to not engage the enemy. Make it to Jaffa, besiege Jaffa, take Jaffa, and that's the goal. Not engage Saladin's forces. The Knights Hospitalier, however, in the rear are being hammered, and so the Knights Hospitalier decide to disregard Richard's orders and begin charging the northernmost flank of Saladin's army. And that charge it has better than expected results. It begins to mow down the Muslim forces. You can see sort of an image of that in the upper right-hand side. And Richard, seeing that the Knights Hospitalier have engaged the enemy, decides to launch the battle at that point. And the Crusaders do an incredibly strong salvo into the Muslim forces. The cavalry, because they are in front of the archers, aren't able to perform their typical feint attack. And so the knights, being heavy cavalry, are more able to take them down. The archers and the swordsmen are also similarly cut down, and the Battle of Arsuf is an incredible victory for the Crusaders, for Richard's forces, as he moves towards Jaffa and reclaiming the entire the entire coast of what is today Israel. So now, having passed through Arsuf, he has arrived at Jaffa, and Richard and Saladin are now in this sort of struggle to figure out how the future area will go. Saladin decides to go with a scorched earth campaign to stop Richard's advances. So you can see in the lower left-hand side of the map, you have Askelon and Yassur. These cities which form the gateway towards Egypt. Askelon is the modern Israeli city of Ashkelon, very close to the Gaza Strip. Yassur is just south of the Gaza Strip. And you can see Gaza also as a citadel. Saladin decides to raze Askelon to the ground, the same with Yassur, in order to prevent Richard from using them. And you can also see that there are 4 fortress cities between Jaffa and Jerusalem. That's Ramla, Lida, Latrun, and Beit Nuba. Ramla, Lida, and are both within Israel proper today. Latrun and Beit Nuba are in today's West Bank territories, just to give you a sense of the geography here. And Beit Lahem, that you see at the bottom, is modern-day Bethlehem, which is also in the Palestinian territories today. But those 4 cities between Jaffa and Jerusalem, those cities are also razed to the ground by Saladin in order to prevent Richard from making use of the resources in those castles to advance towards Jerusalem and take that away, his prize, from his control. So Richard was now debating with his knights, especially the Knights Templar, about what he should do. Richard's desire was to try to retake Ascalon, rebuild the fortifications, then invade Egypt and use the wealth of Egypt as a tool to feed the Crusaders and then march them towards Jerusalem. At this point, however, the majority of the knights were disinterested in that plan because they had come to take Jerusalem. That was their goal. They were holy warriors on a mission, and that's what they were going to do. So Richard decided to follow on the advice of his knights, and he began to attack these now destroyed cities of Ramla, Lida, Latrun, and Beit Nuba. After each one, trying to rebuild the fortress. Of course, every time that they would try to rebuild the fortresses and resupply these areas, Saladin would harry them, send light cavalry after them, and so it was a constant struggle to keep these supply lines open. But surely, slowly but surely, Richard was able to create these points of movement. Then Richard, once he had taken Beit Nuba back, he began to perform scouting raids to see the defenses of Jerusalem. And he even gets within 12 miles of the city. And so he could actually see the Dome of the Rock on the horizon. But for reasons that are not entirely clear, it could be dissension from the nobility over having to build so many new fortresses. It could be, his pressing needs to go back to England. Now that Philip II was back, there were issues that needed to be resolved in England. There are a bunch of different issues that could have made it difficult for Richard to proceed. But for whatever reason, that 12-mile distance is the closest Richard ever gets to Jerusalem. He never besieges the city. He never takes the city, and Saladin retains his prize. Because Richard needs to leave and deal with issues at home, he's willing to actually make a peace treaty with Saladin, and this results in negotiations in the city of Jaffa. And those negotiations in the city of Jaffa lead to a final treaty, the Treaty of Jaffa, which ends up confirming much of what the Crusaders had gained during this conflict. I have a question of what did Saladin destroying a city actually entail? It meant that he destroyed all of the citadel structure. So, right, if you have a city, the city typically at the edge will have walls that repel attack. Then within the city, there is a second armored area called the citadel, which will have usually a castle or a palace and military barracks. Saladin dismembered the exterior wall, he dismembered the citadel wall, and he took down some of the palace structures within the citadel, not necessarily destroying all of it, but basically it makes it a city that, while people can still live in it, is indefensible from a military perspective. I have a question about our offerings. We only do things on Meetup at this point. We haven't reached out to Eventbrite. All right, so at this Treaty of Jaffa, we have these negotiations. So, and the negotiations basically come to three distinct terms. The first term is that narrow strip that Richard had liberated along the coast from Tyre all the way south to Jaffa, that would remain in Christian hands. That would be the new Crusader state of Jerusalem, which, of course, as you can see clearly on the map, does not include Jerusalem. The next part is that the city of Ascalon would remain razed. The Crusaders would not be allowed to take it, rebuild it, or otherwise, because Ascalon, if taken, would be the entry to Egypt, and Saladin needed that area to be safe. And the third condition that they agreed to was that despite the fact that the Christians did not have political control of Jerusalem, they would be permitted to perform regular pilgrimages to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the city of Jerusalem, and therefore they would be able to fulfill their rights as Christians. There's a question about why there are no ruins in Jaffa of a fortress. Jaffa was the site of numerous military encounters after the Crusades. The fortress in Jaffa, I believe, was destroyed by the French in 1801 during Napoleon's siege of the city. Actually, great segue. For those of you who don't know, I do a Middle Eastern history series that's every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And this week, we are talking about Napoleon's entry into the Middle East, which is in 1798 to 1801. And then we are talking about the development of Egypt through the early 1800s under Muhammad Ali Pasha and his successors. Those events are also being hosted by the New York Culture and History Group, so you should be able to find them in the list of upcoming events. So in order to cement Conrad de Montferrat's title as King of Jerusalem, he actually marries Isabel I of Jerusalem, a daughter of Sibyllus, and therefore secures his putative title. That said, as soon as the ink is dry on the Treaty of Jaffa, he is assassinated. We know that he was assassinated by the assassins, right? The ones that we talked about at that fortress in Masyaf. But we don't know why they targeted him. It could be that he had launched several raids against them, that they had had acrimonious relations before, or it could be that somebody else in the Crusader court had paid the assassins. The assassins were known for assassinating people for money as well. So it's not entirely clear why Conrad was killed, but in 1192, he died, and Guy of Lusignan founds the Lusinian dynasty, which ends up controlling the Crusader states. Which ends up controlling the Crusader state of Jerusalem, and for even a longer time, the island of Cyprus. Because when Richard I had made his way to Acre, he had looted and conquered the island of Cyprus, and so he gave it to Guy of Lusignan as a way of getting him out of the Levant and allowing Conrad the ability to patrol the area. Of course, when Conrad died, it sort of obviated the ill will between the two. And I have a question about the Thursday talk on the Middle East. I know that there are two meetups that are connected here. There's the DC meetup and the New York meetup. If you're connected to the New York meetup, it is on there. It should be, as I said, Thursday at 7 p.m. If you're part of the DC meetup, then talk to Robert, and he can help you figure out how to get a link to the New York meetup. Yeah, thank you, Robert. So yeah, all the information about that will be emailed after the program. Now, I'm going to get more in detail about this when we start talking about the Fifth Crusade, but I sort of wanted to explain that Saladin himself didn't have much time after the Treaty of Jaffa either. He died almost as soon as the ink was dry on that as well, in 1193. So it was fortuitous timing for all of them to have signed in 1192. Because that avoided all of the massive problems that Saladin would face. So Saladin had told his family, and you can see this is the simplified version of the Ayyubid family. But Saladin had told his children to recognize his son Afdal Ali as his successor. And even while he was alive, several of his sons and his nephews were vehemently opposed to recognizing Afdal Ali, especially Al-Aziz Uthman, because they considered Afdal Ali to be a weaker ruler, a weaker official than Saladin had been. And so Saladin's great goals had been twofold, right? The first goal, of course, was to take Jerusalem from the Crusaders, and he did achieve that. But his second goal, and perhaps longer goal in importance, and one that's more celebrated today, is that he unified numerous different feuding Muslim city-states. And it seemed that Saladin would not be able to keep that unity after he went into the grave. His children would fight between themselves as to who would be the one in charge of leading the Ayyubid Sultanate. And until the Ayyubid Sultanate is destroyed in 1250, and again, we'll get into more detail as we move into the Fifth Crusade, there is always going to be internecine fights between Ayyubid rulers and a lack of clear and coherent control in those territories. I have a question. If Jerusalem has been taken by Saladin, how is it the Europeans are the kings of Jerusalem. That's the name of the country, right? The name of the country is the Crusader state of Jerusalem. So they keep the name even though they don't control the city. It's the same way that, for example, Taiwan's official name is the Republic of China, even though they don't control any of the mainland of China. So one of the things that is worth pointing out here is that the Armenians are still part and parcel of the Crusader experience, especially the Armenians in Cilicia. And in order to get increased support, especially against Saladin, Levon II tries to create an act of union between the Catholic Church and the Armenians. Now, this act of union breaks down several years later, but within the period that it is active, it allows him to request an official crowning from the Catholic Church, which happens, right? So Prince Levon II becomes King Leon I, and he becomes an official legal ruler of Armenian Cilicia. He maintained good relations, especially with the Knights Hospitalier and the Teutonic Order, especially in the northern regions of Antioch, and he besieged several castles of Saladin's, like Baghras Castle, which is in today Hatay region of Turkey, which is somewhat between Antioch and Armenian Cilicia in terms of its geographic position. Levon was generally more cautious, perhaps we can say, than the leaders of Antioch and of Tripoli in engaging Saladin. And oftentimes, to the extent that the Armenians would lose in engagements with Saladin, it was because they were forced into moving into a more aggressive posture by their erstwhile allies in Antioch and in Tripoli. In fact, it got so bad that the Armenians actually tried to do a regime change in Antioch to install a less aggressive ruler there, but that didn't hold. There's a tale that Saladin and Richard met. During this encounter, apparently Richard displayed the strength of his sword by slicing through a large piece of wood, and in response, Saladin threw up a scarf of silk, which he cut while it drifted down. Is the tale true or apocryphal? I mean, the two of them met many times. It's entirely possible that this happened, but I don't know the specifics. I have a question. Did Muslim leaders at this time have multiple wives so their sons may all have different mothers? Some Muslim rulers did, some Muslim rulers did not. The harem structure was more common in Turkic kingdoms than it was in Arab or Kurdish-led kingdoms. Of course, that does change as time moves on and Ottoman culture becomes more normalized. But at this point, I believe Saladin had a few princesses consort, but only one wife. So now we're shifting from the Third Crusade to the Fourth Crusade. And one of the things that we sort of have to understand is that the situation in the Middle East was such that it became clear that another crusade was immediately necessary. The question, of course, became the funding for it. And so you ended up with a lot of people making their way down to Venice and struggling to figure out how they would get the money necessary to pay the Venetians to take them to the Middle East. Now, separate to that, in the Byzantine Empire, we also have dynastic succession issues. So you have Isaac II, who becomes emperor of the Byzantine Empire, and he is overthrown by his brother, Alexios III Angelos, in 1195. And Alexios III Angelos jails Isaac, but allows his son, also named Alexios. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of Alexioses I'll try to use the numbers to keep them consistent. So Alexios III jailed Isaac II, but his son, who would become Alexios IV, managed to escape. And Alexios IV wanted help overthrowing Alexios III, but he had no military at his disposal. Well, now we have a very interesting situation, right? We have a number of people who are willing to fight, willing to die, and armored to the teeth. And we have a very rich person who need money desperately, and a very rich person who's willing to buy an army. So this becomes a very interesting situation. The first thing the Crusaders try to do is try to work off their payment to the Venetians with the Venetians directly. The Venetians had been fighting with the city of Zadar in what is now Croatia. The city had been taken from the Venetians by the Hungarians, and the Venetians wanted it back. So they sent the Crusaders off to the city to take it. Some of them did, some of them did not. But in Zadar, Alexios IV managed to meet these Crusaders, and they began to talk shop with Alexios IV promising them 200,000 ducats, which was an incredibly high amount of money, in exchange for unseating his uncle, the tyrant Alexios III, and putting himself or his father, Isaac II, in power. And in exchange for that, and for in exchange for that, he would help us provide them with food and help them on their way to Egypt. Now, that may sound a little surprising because we talked about how when Richard went, that choosing Egypt as a goal alienated a large number of Crusaders. At this point, it seems like that had become a relatively acceptable first move in the Crusades, would be to attack Egypt. I have a comment that images of the Crusades show a lot of horses. Did Crusaders bring horses by boats from Europe, or did they acquire their horses once they arrived in the Middle East? They brought their horses with them. In fact, one of the reasons the Venetians were charging them so much to ferry them across the Mediterranean was that they had to rehull the boats in order to accommodate all of the horses that they would be bringing with them. So let's look a little bit at the geopolitical map here. So we've got that Byzantine Empire under Isaac III Angelos, Alexios III Angelos. We've got the Sultanate of Rum. Remember, the Sultanate of Rum is the Seljuk Sultanate. That's a Turkic state. We've got a little Armenia, which is the kingdom of Levon II. We have Cyprus, which is ruled by the Lusignan family. We have the kingdom of Jerusalem, and we have, which there in this map includes Tripoli. We have Antioch, which is still independent, and the realm of the Ayyubids, which of course are Saladin's successors. To the east, we have a number of Turkic states: the Mengücek, the Selçukids, the Shah Arman, the Mohoene, the Artukids, the Atabeq of Mosul. All of these territories are controlled by Turkic sovereigns that are in some kind of alliance with Rum. And of course, this was also, for those of you who are more familiar with Caucasian history, this was one of the heights of Georgia. This was right around the time that Queen Tamar was ruling the country. So we now have in power Pope Innocent III. Pope Innocent III is actually quite famous for being a crusading pope. He greenlit the Fourth Crusade, the Fifth Crusade, and the Sixth Crusade. He also greenlit the crusade against the Almohads in Spain, which resulted in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, for those of you who know Spanish history. And he also greenlit the Albigensian Crusade, which was against the Cathar heresy in the south of France. He was very much against the idea that the Catholic faith should be broken or changed. And he also signed off on Egypt being the first primary target. He did not sign off on this new changing of the route from Egypt to Constantinople due to the arrangements with Alexios IV. And in fact, when he heard about the Battle of Zadar, right, which was a battle against Catholic Christians in the city of Zadar, the Hungarians were Catholics, as were the Croatians. He threatened excommunication for anybody who continued to kill more Catholics or other Christians. And the Crusaders simply did not listen. I see that there's a raised hand. If you can put your comment in the chat, I'll respond to it. All right. So they made their way to Constantinople, and it's important to describe what Constantinople looks like at this point, because it is an incredibly complicated city. So we have what's here called the Horn, which is the area of Constantinople that juts into the Bosporus. And it has a number of walls that run along the sea, which are called the sea walls. But the real most powerful walls are the walls of Theodosius. And you can see them from sort of a sky view. First, there is a canal that separates the walls from the rest of the mainland. Then there is a first wall that you have to besiege on the far side of the canal. Then there is a second wall with ramparts. Then there is the third main wall, each of which between them is a piece of land that you have to take over ground, which means that there's a lot of breaching that you have to do if you want to take the land walls. The sea walls are far easier to breach in that you don't have this regimented system. However, the sea walls are difficult to breach because on the southern coast, you have all of the currents coming from the Sea of Marmara. On the northern side, you have the chains across, you have the chains of the Horn, which you can see on this map. Now, the chains on the Horn are literal chains. You have metal chains that are constructed across that narrow channel and connect the city of Galata, which is on the northern side, with what's now called Sultan Ahmet, or the Horn on the lower side. And those chains are strong enough that ships moving through cannot budge them. And we've seen this before with the chains on the Nile River when we talked about the War of Egyptian Succession. But these chains were even better constructed than those on the Nile. And so what the Venetians and the Crusaders would need to do in order to take the city of Constantinople would be to break the sea chains or get around them somehow and try to conquer the city via the sea walls, because the walls of Theodosius, the land walls, were just functionally impregnable. I have a question about the chains. No, the chains are made of metal. The chains are not in the water. The chains are above the water. So the fact that they're near the sea doesn't lead to them rusting. I have a question about what would have been the chief differences in metals in the construction of the chains. Different metals oxidize differently and react to water differently. So if you have iron tends to react with water and rust. That's why I think that person asked the question. They weren't concerned so much about rust. They were concerned much more about just the maintenance of keeping the ships out, because the chains wouldn't be used in peacetime. They would only be used in war. So it's not like they would be hanging there for decades and decades. In terms of the differences between how the Egyptians did it and the Turks did it, first of all, the Turks aren't doing this. This is the Byzantines. But in terms of how the Egyptians would do it and the Byzantines would do it, I don't really think that there's much of a distinction. This is a pretty well-established technology at this point. Of course, today it doesn't make sense to put chains because you can explode them with artillery. At that time, they didn't have that capability. So putting chains across rivers had been a technique used throughout medieval warfare. All right. So this sort of shows more in depth the breaching of the seawall. So what the Venetians have managed to do, if we go back to the previous slide for a little bit more clarity, you can see to the northern side of the channel, you have the town of Galata. So what the Crusaders decided to do was conquer the city of Galata. Therefore, they were able to bring down the chains because they were on the Galata side. And then their ships went through. So then you now have these ships on the northern side of the Horn, and they start sending their people over the wall, um, and into the city. I have a question of how did the merchant ships pass the chain? The merchant ships didn't need to pass the chain. They would go on the southern side because the southern side of the Bosphorus is exposed. If you mean the ships that are coming from the north, from inland, those also didn't need to pass the chain because they would be arriving in Constantinople anyway. If you're referring to during peacetime, the chains weren't up in peacetime, so it's not really an issue. I have a question. Is the city of Galata part of Istanbul? Of course. The modern city of Istanbul is massive. It is a 15 million person city and covers significantly more territory than what it covered during the Byzantine period. The area that is now called Beyoğlu includes the district of Galata. Beyoğlu is a very central part of the city of Istanbul. The area of the Horn is now called Sultan Ahmet. But those are just two of the regions in Istanbul. Istanbul has something like 30 different regions. I have a question. Was the sacking of Constantinople at this point a Catholic Christian versus Byzantine Christian conflict or just a riches grab? We're definitely going to talk about that. If not today, then next week. And the football team Galatasaray is named after the city. Yes. Galata is the neighborhood. Saray means palace in Turkish. And there are a number of palaces that are built in Galata region, not at this point, but in during the Turkish controlled period. All right, so once these crusaders have gotten up to the top of the sea walls, they encounter stiff resistance from the Byzantine Orthodox Christians who control the city, and you can sort of see that memorialized in the picture in the left-hand side. But once they had gotten to the top of the towers, the Crusaders needed the ability to push the Byzantines back from the walls and be able to effectively assault the city. So what they decide to do is they decide to light fires that spread throughout the city, and these cause an incredible amount of destruction, especially in the quarters closest to the northern side of the city. In retaliation, Byzantine Orthodox attack Latins who were living in the city. Now, remember, the Byzantine Empire had trade relations with the Genoese, with the Venetians, with a number of other groups from Europe. And so there was a Latin quarter within the Byzantine city of Constantinople that would accommodate these Latin Christians. Now, of course, they were seen as being allies of the Crusaders who were attacking. And so their areas were also burnt down by angry Orthodox who were despairing at seeing their own city being put to the sword. So once the Crusaders were finally able to breach the city, they then turned to Alexios IV, who they empowered. They removed Alexios III from the city, and Alexios III went into the western areas west of the city of Constantinople, the modern region of Eastern Thrace, and tried to consolidate a military. Alexios IV requested that the Crusaders hunt him down and prevent him from doing that, which they did. And then they turned to Alexios IV and said, pay up. And Alexios IV sort of threw up his hands and he said, you know, I have this much money, but I don't have the 200,000 ducats that I promised you. And the Crusaders could see that Alexios IV was not terribly popular in the city. His father, Isaac II, had been murdered. So he wasn't a possible candidate for emperor, and Alexios IV was seen as a young child, impetuous, and undesirable. And at the same time, the fact that he was installed by the Crusaders meant that he was also seen as strongly illegitimate. So he had a hell of a time even keeping the city under his control. And so the Crusaders decided that, well, if you're not going to give us the money we need, we might as well just take the city. And so we begin a large-scale sacking of Constantinople. There is a saying that the Fourth Crusade resulted in 1 million casualties, none of whom were Muslim. And most of that refers to what happened here. A number of Byzantine relics were destroyed. The horses of St. Mark from the Hippodrome were taken from Constantinople and brought to Venice, where they are still at the Piazza San Marco, the San Marco Plaza. And a number of other relics were taken, stolen, repatriated to Europe. And many local inhabitants were killed. You can see on the left-hand side a painting of the Crusaders torching the city, and Greek Orthodox priests valiantly trying to defend the artifacts of what was ostensibly their shared Christian faith. I have a question as to why the Catholic Christians would fight Byzantine Orthodox Christians. At this point, what the Crusaders were doing was primarily in the pursuit of money. It wasn't because of any sort of religious validation. They felt that they were owed wealth and prestige, and they were going to take it. So this starts what is called by historians as the Latin Empire. Now, the people controlling the territory didn't call it that. They call it the Roman Empire, but that's confusing. So historians generally tend to avoid that title. The Greek-speaking people of the Byzantine Empire call it the Francocratia, or the rule by the Franks, which I think is probably the best name for it. But you then have the former Byzantine Empire broken up into a number of different pieces. You can see here the Despotates of Epirus, the Duchy of Athens, the Principality of Achaia, the Duchy of Athens, the Emirates of Nicaea, all surrounding the Latin Empire. And these different states fought amongst themselves and against the Latin Empire for control of Constantinople and its environs. Additionally, the Bulgaria, which was ruled by the Bulgars, it wasn't the modern Slavic Bulgarians, it was ruled by the Bulgars at this point. They also were Orthodox, and they believed that to have Roman Catholic rule in Constantinople, in the heart of Orthodoxy, was blasphemous. And accordingly, they were also at war with the Francocratia. There's a question as to whether the horses were moved for a time to Paris under Napoleon. That is correct. They were taken from Venice. They were brought to Paris, but they were repatriated to Venice after Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. They were never given back to the Ottomans, who now controlled the city of Istanbul. Now, because the Francocratia was surrounded on multiple sides by multiple enemies, all of which knew the terrain and had many more people at their disposal than the Francocratia had, they began to lose land relatively quickly. That said, all those empires had to focus on defeating the Francocratia and couldn't manage their other frontiers. And this resulted in a massive change of politics between the Empire of Nicaea, right, which was the remainder of the Byzantine Empire on the Asian side, and the Seljuk Turks, because previously the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Turks had not gone over very well. They had been antagonistic parties. The Seljuks had won a massive victory against the Byzantines at Microkephalo only 30 years ago, and the two groups had fought over many strips of land especially during the reign of Ioannis Komnenos in the 1140s. So the need of the Empire of Nicaea to turn its attention westward to deal with Constantinople being under the rule of the Francocratia meant that the two of them signed a peace treaty, and the Seljuks began focusing more on their eastern front than on their western front. This leads to the largest expansion in the history of the Seljuk Sultanate. You can see that, unfortunately, I couldn't find a map in English. This map is in Spanish. So you can see the city of Iconio, which is the modern Turkish city of Konya. And that was really their capital city, but they began to expand from Konya outwards to a number of other towns and cities. We will discuss the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome and the rest of the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade next time we meet. I guess we'll have to talk about probably a fifth meeting, because there's no way we can get through 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 crusades in an hour and a half. So we may have to do a fifth session, but this is where we're going to stop for today.
Richard, if we need to continue, that's no problem. Do you want me to just add it on to the week after the fourth week, like 2 weeks from today? Okay, yeah, that's no problem. Take as long as you want.
I just hope that everybody's as excited and as interested to continue as I am.
Oh, yeah, we are.
Okay. So
it's just, I keep repeating it. I hate to sound like a broken record, but to me, it's just, this is just so amazing, because this is such a fascinating history with so many different people and places and events and countries, and it covers this long time frame. God, I just, as a person who's not as familiar with this part of history, just really amazing how complex this story is. So you did a really great job kind of walking us through all this and going through the nuances of it. So really appreciate that.
No, I mean, the thing is that people imagine that, things 100 years ago or 200 years ago were somehow had fewer moving parts than they do today. And that's not the case. There's a lot of different people doing a lot of different things that don't make sense if you use simplistic analysis of cross beats crescent. It's not, that's not it. And so you have these alliances between Christians and Muslims against other Christians or Muslims. So somebody's asked a question about where Venice is and where Sicily is. This map might be a little bit helpful here. So you can see this is Venice in the northeastern side of Italy, right? And here's Sicily. Now, when we talk about the Kingdom of Sicily, which might be where the confusion started from this map, the Kingdom of Sicily is roughly the lower half of Italy today, and was a territory that was more or less united because based in Naples, a lot of the people were farmers. And so you had these large tracts of land. And you can compare this to Northern Italy, which was much more industrialized and commercialized. Well, commercialized before being industrialized, right? And so it was built into a number of different city-states that were all self-governing. So for those who are familiar with the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, the biggest difficulty in the Risorgimento was unifying the North. And Camillo de Cavour, who was leading from Savoy, which is sort of a defunct state on the border of France and Italy. But Camillo de Cavour had to create a number of treaties to pull together all the different statelets in the north, and even had to declare war to conquer Venice, war on Austria to conquer Venice. But when Garibaldi was unifying the south, he just marched soldiers right up from Sicily up to Rome. He just did that in one shot. Now, Garibaldi was also an astute military commander, but it's much easier to unify an already unified state. I have a question: was Italy unified in the mid-19th century? That's exactly correct. Italy was unified in the 1840s.
Rich, a quick question.
Yeah.
So we do have on our YouTube channel, which we'll post the history of Turkic people, or so have you. Just maybe like in a sentence or two, where the Seljuks originate from. Just maybe just. So
well, I mean, we covered where the Seljuks originally come from in the first of the Crusades presentations. They come from Central Asia. Actually, I think I can probably find the slide if I go back far enough. But they originate in what today we would say is Uzbekistan, maybe southern Kazakhstan, maybe northern Turkmenistan, that sort of area of Central Asia. They make their way through Iran. They conquer the various Turkic states that already existed in Iran and impose their own Turco-Persianate governance style, and then they expand into Anatolia with the Battle of Massacre. And that's where they come from. If you're talking about the video that we have about the history of the Huns on our website, that covers much more of the ancient period before what's called the Gupta Khaganate, and that's really before the Turks as an ethnic group appear on the scene. So there are people who connect the Huns and some of the Hunnic people of Central Asia to the modern Turks, because there probably were Turks in the coalition of nomadic peoples that existed, but none of them called themselves a Turkic coalition.
Right. One, and I still keep coming back to the fascination of the Hashashins or assassins. Why were they assassinating so many, heads of Seljuk Empire, particularly, and why it was so in the governance of the Seljuk governance? Is it because they were in total threat to assassins?
Why did the Seljuks try to destroy the assassins?
No. Assassins were hired to assassinate a lot of the governors in the states that was part of the Seljuk Empire, so to speak. So,
sure. There are several reasons for this. First of all, we have to sort of split what happens in the Great Seljuk Empire, right? The Great Seljuk Empire is the area of what is now Iran today. And there were assassins in Iran, in the northwestern region. For those of you who know Iranian geography, this is just south of Gilan, near the area of Mazandaran. For those of you who don't know Iranian geography that well, the northwestern part of Iran, close to the Caspian Sea, but not on the Caspian Sea. They had a number of mountain fortresses there, including the most fabled fortress of Alamut. And while they were there, they were involved in a civil war between Berkyaruk, who was one of the great Seljuk candidates, and Muhammad I Topar, who was another great Seljuk candidate. And so these two were fighting a civil war. Berkyaruk enlisted the assassins to fight on his side against Muhammad I Topar. And so you have a number of assassinations of Arabeg or nobles or leaders in Muhammad I's army. That's what happens in the east. What happens in the west, the area that we're covering today, right, the Levant region, it's much more based on what is in the interest of Masyaf and the other Syrian castles of the assassins surviving. So you have early battles after the First Crusade, like in the early 1100s, where you have the assassins fielding armies on the side of the Crusader states, not with them, but in parallel to them, right? They're sort of erstwhile allies, not functional allies. And those two armies are fighting against the Seljuks and some of the lower level Arabeg and Emirates that are bordering them, because those Emirates, should they unite, would be a greater threat to the assassins than the Crusader states are. The Crusader states are not powerful enough to extend their influence at that point. Once the Crusader states start demonstrating the power and influence they have through the War of Egyptian Succession, then the assassins become much more neutral towards the Crusaders. And then eventually, when they create their situation of neutrality towards Saladin, they sort of retreat from the conflict altogether.
Excellent answer. Thank you. And I guess the last question I have, why was there such a, I mean, we know why there was deterioration of the different crusades, but it came to a point where they even sent children crusade that actually got conquered in Sicily and was sold off as slaves. So it was getting to a point of ridiculousness. Was there any stop? There was like, guys, we can't really send children. What is going on here, really?
No, well, no, there was definitely no, you definitely had a reaction in Europe of how horrendous this is, that, you know, children are going. But by and large, until, I mean, the term crusade was still used to refer to campaigns against the Ottoman Turks, right? One of the things I was going to cover is that the battle organized by by several of the kings of Hungary against the Ottoman Empire in 1444 was called the Crusade at Varna. Varna being a city in what's today Bulgaria, because that area was under Turkish control. So this idea of going on crusade to defeat the Muslim enemy controlling territory that should in theory belong to Christians according to the Crusader, it doesn't really go out of vogue until the world stops being organized according to this religious lens. And the change for that is what's called modernity, right? The development of modern ideas and ways of thinking that tend to centralize things other than religious identity as forms of identity and meaning. I have a question of, did the assassins receive hashish to perform the murders that they did? There was definitely use of drugs. It might not have been hashish. It probably was something more serious like opiates. And I discussed it a little bit in, I believe it was the second entry into the series. But they didn't receive it to perform the murders. They received it habitually. And it was sort of trained to give them an idea of what paradise would be like. That sort of euphoric state of being on these drugs was what you would achieve when you were killed and you had performed your holy martyrdom through the act of assassination. Now, of course, I need to clarify that according to Islamic belief, even Nizari Ismaili Islamic belief, mainstream Nizari Ismaili Islamic belief, assassination is not a form of jihad, is not an acceptable way of fighting war or dealing with political situations, but the assassin order believed that it was, and believed that you would achieve paradise through these actions. And so they would say that the way that you feel on these drugs is a taste of the paradise you will receive. And that, of course, is an incredible amount of motivation if you think you're going to feel that amazing every second of every moment. And I think that's part of what motivated them. I have another question of how many deaths did the Crusades cause? I don't know how you even begin counting. Like, do you count the people, for example, who died because all the wars prevented trade, which would have, led to greater food arriving in area X or area Y? Like, it becomes astronomical. In terms of the people who died on the battlefield, we're probably talking about hundreds of thousands over the course of several centuries. If you're talking about civilians, I mean, the Fourth Crusade alone probably killed about 1 million people. Between Zadar and Constantinople, the amount of people who died, the amount of homes that were burned. Constantinople at its height had a population of 1 million, between 500,000 and 1 million people. So it's not out of bounds to say that the Fourth Crusade may have been up to 1 million dead. Somebody asked if I'm familiar with the Assassin's Creed video game. I was, and I did mention it when we got to the siege at Masyaf. You may have missed that earlier part of the discussion. Once you get after the first entry into the series, which is somewhat historical in that you have the major cities of the Crusades and they're controlled by the right people for the time of the Third Crusade, and the interaction with Saladin, that's the crowning moment of the game, mirrors the confrontation with Saladin and Masyaf in the video game. Once you get past the first entry into the series, things start going weird in terms of the timeline. And it becomes less historically accurate. Like, for example, if you look at the second game in the series, you have Ezio Auditore, who is this person who lives in Florence. We have no record of such a person ever existing. We have no evidence that there was ever an assassins group based in Italy. That makes no sense because the assassins are a Nizari Ismaili order. And according to actual history, the Nizari Ismaili were that while that religion survived, the assassin order was destroyed by Hulagu Khan in 1250 through an incredibly brazen act of force against the mountain fortresses of Alamut and several of the other mountain fortresses of the assassins. we have no trace of them in the historical record after that. Now, the video game tends to say, like, no, the assassins went into hiding. They had some secret. No, only people who knew them knew that they existed. Like, because the game has to sort of thread the reality of them not existing with the plot line that they want to promote in any of the stories. And while I'm not going to comment on the plot lines outside of the Islamic world, there is one called Assassin's Creed Revelations, which takes place in Constantinople during the Ottoman period. The plot is unrealistic to the extent that none of the Paleologos leaders, who are the antagonists in the video game, were ever trying to upset the Ottoman order. And there certainly weren't Templars involved. The Templar order didn't exist at that point as well. Of course, the game claims that the Templar order also went into secret in the whole thing. One of the questions I have here is, I spoke earlier about the expensive ferrying horses. I suddenly realized how much they added to the cost, strategy, supply. Can you imagine if knights needed to bring replacement horses? How did they get horses? Replacement horses did exist in the Levant. There was a horse growing culture among the new Crusader states that built up, and people bought and sold horses from Armenia. Armenians also raised horses, so that's where horses would come from. But generally, the breeds that were more common in the Middle East were smaller than the horses from Europe, and so people didn't like to switch what breed of horse they were using because they were used to the animals that they were used to. There's a question of how did the Jews fare from the Crusades. I covered the pogroms in Europe during the People's Crusade in the first century in this series, so you can go back and watch that. In terms of during the Crusader states, Jews were generally tolerated in the Crusader states. They had a lower status than Crusaders and Latins, and a lower status than the next level down, which was the non-Latin Christians. They were categorized with the Muslims. They were tolerated, but they weren't given legal protections. They could not bear arms. They were subject to some massacres. Saladin actually was very famously friendly towards the Jews. There's a long history of friendship between a lot of the Muslim rulers and the Jewish populations of the Middle East, primarily because the Jews were seen as uninterested in political affiliation, in the sense that they had no loyalties to any particular ruler except the rulers that treated their community well. So since they weren't loyal to the Christian communities any more than they were to the Muslim communities, Muslim leaders tended to trust them. So Saladin was actually very famous for letting Jews back into Jerusalem, because during the Crusader rule, Jews were forbidden from the city of Jerusalem. They were allowed to live elsewhere in the kingdom of Jerusalem, but they were forbidden from the city. In the rest of the area, in Egypt, for example, there was a thriving Jewish community, especially in Alexandria during Saladin's reign. In Constantinople, there was a Jewish community, not a very large one, and the Jewish community of Constantinople would grow substantially under the Ottomans, but during this period it was quite small. During the Francocratia, I don't know if we have sources for the Jewish community in Constantinople during the Francocratia, but during the later period of the Byzantine Empire, it does exist, but it is small. And of course, because they are unarmed and generally have no group that explicitly advocates for them, Jews are more prone to being slaughtered in the various engagements between the different states. There's one other thing that I wanted to add. For those of you who are interested, both the DC and the New York culture groups are hosting with me as sort of an MC a discussion about what is going on in Ukraine, starting in about 30 minutes. So if you guys are interested, please look for that event. As I said, I'm just going to be emceeing the discussion. Ukraine is not my area of expertise. This is more my area of expertise. So I'm very thankful that we have a number of Russians who've also agreed, ethnic Russians, they live in America, who've agreed to step up and sort of discuss the history. And the plan is for it to be about 30 minutes, sort of tracing the history of Ukraine up to the present, sort of showing where it's sort of delineated and interwove its history with that of Russia, and then sort of discussing for the next, let's say, hour and a half, 2 hours, what the political ramifications of the current situation are, what the likely changes are, everything that goes along with that.
And if you want to join us for that, I just posted the link in the Zoom link in the chat. It's not going to be using this Zoom link; it'll be using a separate one. And if you didn't already sign up, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and use the Zoom link that I posted in the chat. And we'll see you in 25 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And the program is being recorded. I'll email out the recording link for it. I probably won't be able to do that though until Monday at the earliest, because I have a jam-packed schedule the rest of the day, today and tomorrow.
Yeah. I have a question of what was the role of women in the Third and Fourth Crusades? Well, women weren't allowed to bear arms. So in terms of their involvement in the actual Crusades, they did nothing. In terms of what were women doing at that time between, let's say, 1187 and 1204, they were doing the kinds of things that we typically, with the exception of certain noble women like Ismat ad-Din Khatun, who we mentioned, or Queen Sibylla that we mentioned, or Isabella I of Jerusalem that we mentioned, with the exception of these specific women who were nobles or monarchs, most women were staying at home. They were helping manage the house, giving birth to kids. That is certainly an important contribution to history, but it's not one that ends up, explaining any political situations, which is most of what this discussion was. In terms of what women were in terms of the homes that women maintained, in the Middle East, it was oftentimes women who had to figure out how to cook foods that they were unfamiliar with, especially Latin women having to meet up with other women from the region and sort of learn how to cook. You also have sort of the experiences of women trying to figure out the new social customs. As is typical in medieval societies, women have a much more pronounced role in mediating social disputes. So that's the case. Now, again, I see people raising their hand. I can't, there's no way that I can let you speak. So just please put your comment in the description, and if you want me to read it out, I'll read it out. And I have a note that the Zoom link that you posted seems to be for Ed's program. The actual link you posted.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah. So Sami, if you have a point that you'd like to make, please put it in the message panel. Otherwise, I think I'll give Rob a few moments to put the Ukraine link in there. But other than that, I think we've just sort of covered it now.
Thank you.
Thanks for our awesome quality control team telling us the link was there. So I just posted the correct one. Although you're welcome to join us for the program tomorrow as well, with a different speaker. But the one that Richard was referring to, I've just posted that in the Zoom chat. If you're watching it live, if you're listening to a recording of this 5 years from now, you can find the recording of the program on our YouTube page.
Excellent. I just want to thank Richard again and to join our History Most Ancient group. We do a lot of exciting stuff, including with Robert collaboration. We'll be doing in-person.
Yeah, we're gonna do some in-person stuff.
Yeah, the 27th of March, if anybody's interested, at 12 o'clock, we're actually going to go to Metropolitan Museum of Arts for Arms and Armor exhibit. And Sergio, which Robert knows very well, and Richard knows him well as well, is going to be the presenter. And after that, we can grab a coffee. It's right next to Central Park. Hopefully the weather is going to be nice. And we have plenty of really good, interesting presentations. Like I said, we have Richard's one on Thursday on Napoleon with Mark. We have on the 15th, we're going to be talking about Qing Dynasty of China. And on the 22nd, the same aforementioned Sergio is going to talk about the 100-Year War. So if people are interested, particularly London crowd, that speaks I guess volumes to where that's the region is from, and so do join us. And with that, thank you.
Yeah, just a quick point of clarity. The Qin dynasty is the beginning of imperial China, right? Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. Yeah, because people sometimes mistake Qin and Qing, which in the Qing Empire is the last empire of China. So it's the first empire of China. So, all right.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's sign off. We'll have a quick break and we'll reconvene with the new, the other Zoom link. Again, I put it in the chat, or you can find it the same place you signed up for this program, and we'll see everyone back in a few minutes.
All right, sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Take care. See you in a little bit.
All right, see you. Bye.